Fellows, it is 7 p.m. Welcome to our District Division B Book Club. Tonight, your host, Roosevelt Jean-Francois. I will be serving as your host and technical coordinator, and our co-host leading this meeting with you tonight is distinguished Toastmaster Marie-Hélène Day. Welcome.
Good evening, everyone. And this is an exciting meeting because we actually have the author in attendance. And the author is Rich Harwood, and he is president and founder of the Harwood Institute for Public Innovation. He has devoted his career to revitalizing the nation's hardest hit communities, transforming the world's largest organizations, and reconnecting institutions like newsrooms and schools to societies. Over the past 30 years, Rich has developed a new philosophy and practice of how communities can solve shared problems, create a culture of shared responsibility, and deepen civic faith. The Harwood practice of turning outward has spread to all 50 US states and is being used in 40 countries. His experience working on the ground to build capacity and coalitions for change gives him a unique, powerful insight on bridging divides and creating resilient communities. In Newtown, Connecticut, after the massacre at Sandy Hook Elementary School, Rich led the process for the community to collectively decide the fate of the school building. Today, Rich is spreading a vision for what it takes to create communities, lives in an America that reflects the best in us and the best of us. In his newest book, Stepping Forward, an Amazon bestseller, Rich provides a new and inspiring blueprint to rediscover what we share in common and to build upon it. Rich is an inspiring, sought-after speaker who regularly keynotes major conferences and events. He has written 5 books, scores of articles, and numerous groundbreaking reports. He's also written numerous studies and articles and has appeared on national media, including NPR, CNN's Inside Politics, PBS Newsletter, NewsHour, and C-SPAN. We are excited to be joined today by Rich Harwood and learn more about how we can each step forward and get on a positive, practical path to transform our communities and our lives. And please welcome Rich Harwood.
Thanks, Mary Helen. It's great to be with everyone. I appreciate my brother inviting me and setting this up, and thanks for all of you for coming out on a Saturday night. I know we're all living busy lives. We're all tired and fatigued from this pandemic and other things that are intruding on our lives. So thanks so much. I also know that so many of you are part of Toastmasters. So here's the caveat for me tonight. I beg of you not to score me on how well my speaking ability as we spend some time together tonight. So, but thanks so much for coming. And when we set this up, I was just asked to talk for a few minutes. So let me just open up with some comments that maybe get you thinking, and then really to get a conversation going among all of us. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes,
We'll
I'm
recall.
listening to you well.
We discuss together.
I will mute everybody, and you may unmute yourself, Richard.
Okay. Can you all hear me now?
Yes.
It probably would have gone much better if you couldn't hear me. So as I was saying, I was just going to start with a few comments, and I think some of you may have heard me say that I know I'm speaking before a group of many of you are part of Toastmasters, and the only thing that I beg of you is not to score my speaking abilities as we're going through the night together here. I wrote this book before COVID hit, and I was on a speaking tour. I hit about 20 communities in about 3 months, and then COVID all of a sudden hit. And we are now, as you know, facing 4 simultaneous crises that are unprecedented in American history. There's this global pandemic that has wreaked havoc on our country, over 500,000 people now dead. And I think importantly has laid bare the disparities and inequities that have long existed in our country, but now are really clear to so many of us. This global pandemic has created economic upheaval in so many of our lives. So many of our fellow Americans have been laid off from work. So many fear being laid off from work. So many fear being evicted from their homes and from their apartments. So many of us have lost our livelihoods if we own a small business. And it's going to take us years to recover from that. We are engaged in a reckoning with systemic racism and social injustices that has been crystallized by the murder of George Floyd. But as you know well, systemic racism has been with our country for over 400 years since the founding of this nation. And I think this reckoning with systemic racism right now means that we can no longer turn away from it. We can no longer turn our backs on it. And we can no longer pretend that it doesn't exist, because it does for so many of our fellow Americans. And lastly, we face a political crisis. And when I say that, people often think of Donald Trump, and some of you actually may be Trump supporters. But that's not what I mean. Obviously, in the last 4 years, our political crisis has become more acute. It reached its apex with the insurrection on January 6th. But I've been writing about and tracking this political crisis for nearly 4 decades now. And in those 4 decades, if not longer, far too many of us increasingly no longer trust our political leaders. Far too many of us no longer trust our political institutions. Far too many of us no longer trust religious institutions. Far too many of us no longer trust our local civic organizations. And frankly, far too many of us no longer trust one another in our communities, our own neighbors. We no longer trust. And so the question for us, I believe, is how do we create a more equitable, a more fair, a more just, a more inclusive, a more hopeful society moving forward? And let me just be clear about something. I don't believe, as some people say, that we can't wait to get back to normal. I don't believe we can go back to normal. And I don't believe, frankly, that normal is something we want to go back to. If you were a Black or brown person in America before all these crises hit, normal wasn't all that good for you. If you suffered from mental health crises before these crises hit, normal wasn't all that good for you. Normal wasn't all that good for you if you didn't have access to healthcare. Normal wasn't all that good for the millions of Americans who go to bed hungry every single night long before these crises ever hit. Normal wasn't all that good for folks who were afraid to walk down the street at night because they feared crime in their local communities. And so I don't believe that our choice is to go back to normal. I believe the fundamental choice we face as Americans is whether or not we have the courage and the willingness and the wherewithal and the fortitude to reimagine and recreate our lives, our communities, and our society moving forward, which is something we have done throughout American history, and that I believe that we're called to do again today. I also happen to believe that in order to do this, much of the work that we need to do has to happen in our local communities. It's not that I don't believe that we need action in Washington, D.C. on a whole slew of issues. It's not that I don't believe that if you live in Florida, you don't need action in Tallahassee, or if you're in New York, you don't need action in Albany, or if you're calling in and you visit and work in Anchorage, that you don't need action from Juneau. But so much of the work that we need to do has to happen in our local communities, because it's there where we can unleash the potential of our communities and our country. And it's there where we can restore our belief in ourselves and in one another, that we can come together and get things done, which I think is one of the crises that we face in our country today. So let me just mention 4 quick things that I think we need to do, that I talk about in the book in slightly different language, but I'll just mention really quickly because I don't want to take up too much of our time with me speaking at you as opposed to having a conversation with you tonight. The first thing I think is, if we want to unleash our potential and restore our belief and get on a more hopeful path in our country, then we have to make the choice to turn outward toward one another in our local communities and in our society. In far too many places in the communities I work with, the people I work with, far too many of us are turned inward toward ourselves. We are hunkered down, we are in retreat. And unless and until we turn outward, only when we turn outward can we understand what really matters to us. Only when we turn outward can we see and hear one another. Only when we turn outward can we join together and take action together. And importantly, particularly now, given the divisions that we face in the country and the recriminations that are going on, only when we turn outward can we afford every single individual in our society the dignity they deserve. Dignity that I believe is a God-given right. Dignity that I believe is a natural human right. And for far too long, we have given lip service to dignity. We only give dignity to people who look like us. We give dignity to people who live in the same neighborhoods as us. We give people dignity who have the same economic status as us. We only give dignity to people who pray to the same God as us. We only give dignity to people based on who they love and why they may love that individual. And it seems to me that if we actually believe that dignity is a God-given right and is fundamental to moving our country forward and bringing everyone along with us, then dignity has to be for all of us, not just for some of us. So turning outward is one thing. Second, I think we need to get in motion. We need to get in motion. It's only when we're in motion that we can begin to achieve things. It's when we're in motion that we can begin to see what the possibilities are before us. It's when we're in motion that we can discover others who share common interests as us and we can join together. It's when we're in motion that we can discover new partners who want to join with us. It's when we're in motion that serendipity that can occur that we never could have predicted, but for the fact that we are in motion. It's when we're in motion that we release a chain reaction of actions, one building on the other, that enable us to get moving in a new direction. And so if we believe, as some of my colleagues do, that all we need to do is get into more forums and talk to one another more, and somehow we will resolve all our differences, I'm here to say as clearly as I possibly can tonight that we will not make progress. We will simply get lodged in more debates and more discussions and more finger pointing and more recriminations. And it's when we're in motion that we begin to discover our innate capabilities, our shared humanity, and we unlock possibilities to talk about harder and harder issues that are before us. So that's number two. You still with me? All right, number three. Number three, we've got to start small to go big. There is a value in America that the only things that are worthwhile are really big things. That the only things worthwhile are things that sound sophisticated, that are complex, that are complicated, that are shiny, that are new. And we can spend all our time planning these comprehensive big things, but I don't know what you're seeing, but in all the communities that I'm working in all across the country, and what I look at over across the nation, is that we continue to build initiatives that are too big, that we don't have the public will to support, we don't have the capacities and readiness and appetite to support. And what we need to focus much more on is how do we get things moving? And I'm about to release a new book called Unleashed, which I hope you'll get when it comes out in a month or two. And in it, what we track is that when things start small in communities, as I said before, they set off this chain reaction and they grow over time and build on each other over time. And it's over time that we can begin to create more systemic change and build the support for the change that we need in much larger, bigger ways. And so if the first one is turn outward and the second one is get in motion, this third point I want to make is start small to go big. And the last point I'll make is that we need to focus on creating a new trajectory of hope. A new trajectory of hope. I don't know any American who believes that we're going to solve our education problems overnight, or solve systemic racism overnight, or solve food insecurity overnight. I don't know anyone. What they really want to know is not whether or not we can solve these things overnight, because that would just be more false promises and pledges that we know we ought not to make because we can't keep, and which creates more frustration and cynicism among us. Instead, what Americans really want to know is, can we get moving in a better direction, in a better trajectory, with growing, not diminishing momentum and ever expanding civic confidence. And to do that, we've got to think about what will create that trajectory moving forward. And to do that, one of the things that we need to do is make more visible the change that we are creating, because I'm convinced that so much of the change that we are creating, whether it's through the things people came together to do through COVID, or the education change that I'm seeing in communities, is invisible to us. And it's overwhelmed by the negativity and the incriminations in our society that we have towards one another, and the pointing of fingers toward each other, questioning each other's motives. And so if we want to create this new trajectory of hope, then we need to make it more of our business to make visible the change we are creating and to lift it up and to begin to tell stories about it and to weave those stories into a new can-do narrative that we actually can come together and get things done in our country. Now, last couple of points. Some people say this can't be done, that this vision I'm laying out is too naive, that we're too polarized in this country, we're too divided in this country, that our politics is too calcified in this country, that things like the insurrection just go to show that there are people who voted for Donald Trump and people who voted for Joe Biden, and they will never come together. But, you know, I'm working in Winchester in Clark County, Kentucky. 65% of the people there voted for President Trump. When we first started working there in this community, the community was divided by race. It was divided by religion. It was divided by geography. It was divided by economics. The kids who were going to blue ribbon schools felt abandoned by adults who were suffering from meth and opioid addiction. In 2.5 years, this community has wrapped their arms around their kids and lifted them up and given them a new sense of possibility. In 2.5 years, they've changed the direction on the opioid and meth crisis. And they have now more people going into treatment and making it through treatment and getting jobs and being supported by the community than ever before. They have religious groups that were once in competition about putting people in seats so that they could fill their churches on Wednesday nights and Sunday mornings, who are now working together across their congregations for the good of the community. This is a community that has reckoned with their history of slavery and bigotry and racism, not just from 400 years ago, but racism that still exists today. And they are making strides forward on dealing with racism and bigotry and implicit bias. And when COVID hit, over 60 representatives from different groups came together, groups that had been fragmented, had been engaged in turf battles, who had been fighting for scarce resources, and came together and started to address issues of COVID, ensuring that families didn't fall through the cracks, that kids who had been traumatized were getting the mental health support that they needed, that people who were about to be evicted from their homes were no longer going to be evicted from their homes and were safe in their homes again. And they are beginning to address the systemic issues that they long believed they would never be able to address. 2.5 years ago, they believed that their best years were behind them, and what they needed to do was to recreate their past. 2.5 years later, they are now realizing that their future is ahead of them and that they have the innate capabilities in their community and the know-how and the wisdom and the resources to create a better future for all of their people in this community, not just for some of them. So this is the story of America, right? This is the story of America. This is the last thing I'll say. We were a country founded on original sin. We enslaved people from overseas and we took land from indigenous people and drove them essentially into refugee camps. But we have, over time, continued to strive toward creating a more perfect union in our country. We abolished slavery. We created women's suffrage. We passed voting rights and civil rights. We created seatbelt laws. In Georgia, they are ensuring now that every individual has access to voting, and they're fighting for that in North Carolina as well. So we can look at all the challenges we face and say that we can't get things done, Or we can look to our history, and we can even look to how we've responded to COVID and say that we do have the capacities to make things happen if we are willing to come together in our local communities, turn outward toward one another, get in motion, start small so that we can go big, and create a much more hopeful trajectory where every single American, regardless of the color of their skin, their heritage, their native language, where they live, their zip code, how much money they have, can have a shot at the American dream and can fulfill their God-given potential. So let me end there. It's probably took a little longer than I had hoped. But let me see if that generates some conversations. As some of you know, I'm from New York. I love disagreements. I love to be challenged. So please don't be shy about that. And we'd love to hear your comments and thoughts. And if you did get a chance to read the book, we'd love to hear your comments about that as well.
Thank you, Rich. Tonight, our moderator for this evening is Adriana Arias. And Adriana actually did do a review of Rich's book a while ago. She does have some questions that she's going to start out with. My question for Roosevelt, who is our tech coordinator, I noticed that has our chat been opened up so people can add questions into the chat?
The chat will be open right now.
It will open up for people. Okay, put your questions in chat and Adriana will call on you to ask your question so we can have time here. And I'd like to introduce Adriana Arias.
Thank you, Maria Helen. Can you hear me well? Mm-hmm. Okay. Good evening, everybody, and especially our guest, Richard Harwood. Thank you again for accepting this invitation. And thank you also to the leadership team of the club for allowing me to be the moderator tonight. I am truly honored. Well, without further ado, I will start with some questions, but definitely I think we should take advantage of these minutes of Richard's time because there's just so many questions that I am sure you had after you read the book and after the information and the thoughts that Richard just shared with us. Is really very make us just think a lot about things that sometimes we just don't take the time to think through and analyze what's really our responsibility and what really can we do to help our society. I read Richard's book at the beginning of the pandemic, and at that time, everything was looking great. The news and information all around the world was just negative. And I think I was really very lucky that your book kind of fell in my hands at that particular moment because it brought me hope. Now, I know that with your organization, you have had the opportunity to deal in communities with so many different situations, very hard situations, and also with communities where people are very different. The different not only language like in our club because we speak different languages, but with different backgrounds and with different expectations. And in Toastmasters, we usually have something that we call the icebreaker. And there is a first speech where we are supposed to tell about ourselves and break the ice in the room. Now, my question is, how do you break the ice when you are in the middle of a group where the conversations are going to be controversial? But when people feel like being there with you is an opportunity to find a solution for their problems in the community, and even their families are at stake.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's funny, I actually thought about doing an icebreaker tonight, and I would have asked this question that I'm going to tell you about. So thanks for that question. First of all, let me tell you what I wouldn't do, which I think is equally important. I think we have a habit in our society of focusing too much on the problems. And when we focus on problems from the start as an icebreaker, even as the thrust of our conversations, we want to know why those problems haven't been solved. And when they haven't been solved, we want to know who's responsible for them. And when we want to know who's responsible for them, we want to know who's to blame for why they haven't been solved and who we can start pointing fingers at. And immediately we begin to divide up into our camps again. So that's what I wouldn't do, and that's what I don't do. So let me tell you the question I used in Kentucky last week. When I was doing something, I asked people, when you look out at your community today, what gives you hope? What gives you hope? And people, as you can imagine, well, if I asked you, right, if I asked everyone on this call, let's just do it really quickly. What gives you hope today? Amid all the challenges that we face today, what gives you hope? Anyone?
Well, we have a vaccine.
We have a vaccine. Okay, what else? Let's do it quickly. What else gives you hope?
People, you're seeing the good in people.
Seeing the good in people?
It's amazing how some people are coming together to deliver food and just being there for their neighbors.
Okay, what else?
Children.
How so?
Like as a teacher, I see the sparks in their eyes when they learn something new, and they are free to choose and make decisions when you give them that freedom within limits that we talk. So that is hope.
Okay, great. What else? What else gives you hope?
When I see
believe
young
that
people,
are inherently good. I believe that human beings at the essence are good essence. And what we need to do is to get that out. If you
Great.
tell me that I'm bad or my history is bad,
Mhm.
you do not motivate me to come forward.
Right.
But if you
True.
do something that's positive, then you can get me to join.
Okay, Lorraine, do you want to jump in?
yeah, I think seeing young people find their civic and political voice, that gives me hope.
Okay, now just imagine, Adriana, you were saying that there's 6 different languages, I believe, on this call, right? And all of a sudden, people who have different native languages, different accents, different color of skin, different ethnicity, all of a sudden now we share something in common. We share what gives us hope that now creates a foundation upon which we can start to build. Now, the work moving forward gets obviously a lot more complicated, but in 3 minutes, if I'd let this go for 10 minutes or 15 minutes, just imagine what we could have co-created together, which means, to Tom's point, that we would have seen the goodness in ourselves, we would have seen the goodness in other people, we would have seen our innate capabilities to create something together. So all of a sudden now, one of my points was we need to learn how to create things together. In the first 3 minutes, we've already created something together, right? So all of a sudden we're building a foundation for moving forward, and that will enable us to actually deal with the really hard issues that we're going to have to deal with. So that would be my answer.
Thank you. Yes, great answer. And also something that we can definitely apply. Well, Lois Margolin, she has a question.
Yes,
Lois.
thank
go
you,
ahead.
Adriana. So by the time you are called into a city or a situation, hope has got to be at its all-time low. At least that's what I was reading. And I actually did get to the end. So, and I loved your ending, by the way, great ending.
Thank you.
The whole thing is, if they're at their lowest, have you done a lot of research before you step into that town or that city or that school? Or are you completely open-minded and you listen first, then walk away and do your research?
Yeah. So the best analogy would sort of be like what a really good doctor does. So because I've been doing this for 35 years, I have a sense of, before we come into a community, I talk to a number of people who invite us in. So for instance, in Butte County, California, that was traumatized by the Camp Fire. If you remember the fire out in California, right? The largest number of deaths due to forest fire, wildfires in American history. So in talking to people there who invited me, they said the problem that was presented was homelessness because there's been so much displacement from the fire. But as I talked to them, what I learned by asking a lot of questions and listening was that the real issue there is people feel threatened. They feel as though their community is threatened. They feel as though their way of life is threatened. They're scared to work together. They believe people who had received government assistance had unduly spent that government assistance on bad things, so there's mistrust. So their real issue, their underlying issue, as best I can tell, is that the community is traumatized, that people are afraid to engage with one another, and that they can't build the connections in the public will to solve any problem, let alone homeless, which is a really difficult problem to solve. So, but when we go in and actually start to work with folks in Butte County, we're going to spend a lot of time listening, because my belief is that there are too many experts who come into communities who believe because they read some data or they read a report or they read some newspaper articles that they understand people's lived experiences, that they understand what people are going through, that they understand why people are awake at 2 a.m. worried about something, that they understand the obstacles that people are encountering in their lives to make a go of it, that they understand what it is that people are really trying to create in their lives. We're all trying to not just solve problems, we're all trying to create lives for ourselves, our children, our neighbors, our community, right? We want to move forward. We don't simply want to fix something that's around us. And so I don't assume I know any of those answers, even though I've been doing this for so long. And so we have different ways that we spend a lot of time deeply listening to people in the community to understand that. The other thing that does, Lois, is that begins to build trust between and among people. And here's the other thing that it does. There's an old country song, the refrain of which is, I can't see me in your eyes anymore. And what most people, what human beings want more than anything is to be seen and heard and be visible to one another, right? It's a basic human condition. So when we listen to the community and can reflect back to people what really matters in their lives, how they expressed it, why it really matters to them, not simply the problems they're facing, but the lives they're seeking to create, all of a sudden, it begins to draw them in to want to work together, because now they recognize that actually someone is really listening, that despite their differences, they actually do share things in common in this community that they can get working on, and that there are now pathways for them to begin to move forward. And that's how hope gets generated. And that's how belief ultimately gets generated. So it's these series of steps that we take that are pretty careful.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yes, I think something that we can say is also good about us meeting this way, and I just say like in different moments in our lives, is that we definitely are being forced to listen to each other, right? Otherwise, it's impossible to have a conversation like this. And sometimes that's what we don't do, right? We are all thinking all the time and trying to talk at the same time, and this is a great opportunity to listen to each other.
Yeah. Well, the other thing, Adriana, is that, if I can say this, is that, look, if we're serious about systemic racism and social injustice in this country, let's just use that as an example, then we need to be prepared to hear things that we may not want to hear. We need to be prepared to hear about pain that people have experienced, not just in their life, but over generations. We need to be prepared to hear about the sorrow that people have experienced. We need to be prepared to hear about rage that people may feel because they've been denied opportunities or discriminated against, right? And so if we want to get serious about moving our country forward together, then we've got to get serious about the heart. This is not about singing Kumbaya and holding hands and pretending everything is great. This is about actually getting together and recognizing that we have some tough things we got to deal with. And we will be better off by dealing with them rather than sweeping them under a rug for another generation and never getting to solve them and never ensuring that everyone actually has a chance to participate in the American promise, which I think we are obligated to do as Americans.
Great.
Yes.
Lucecita has a question. Lucecita.
Hi, Rick. This is Lucecita.
Hey, how are you?
Very good. Thank you for asking.
Good.
I read your book, and one thing that came to my mind as I was reading the book, it's like, how do we change people's mind to see the big picture and realize that if we work together, we can accomplish anything? I have seen many people that are stuck on the way that they do things, and when they see an option, an opportunity to do it a different way, they get scared, including myself.
Right.
To go to work, I usually take, when I get out of my apartment, I make a right, and then a right, and I go to work, right? But then what about if there's an accident? Then I have to think about what's my option, which way can I go to still get to work? And sometimes it's a little, even for little things like that, I think that we humans are so stuck in the way that we have learned things that it's hard for us to accept change. So how do we change people's mind? How do we talk to them and allow them to understand that change is good?
Yeah. Well, one is I don't believe that we change people's minds. I believe that people change their own minds. And so I think the extent to which, I think this is one of the challenges right now, right? I hear progressives saying we need to change the 74 million people's minds who voted for Donald Trump. And I hear people who voted for Donald Trump saying the opposite. That's a recipe for more gridlock.
Disaster.
It's a disaster. So here's an alternative, couple few points, so I'll try to make them fast. One is I think we need to reframe the discussion to be about what are our aspirations, not a utopian vision, but our aspirations. If you think about what are your aspirations for your life and your community, they come from your gut and they project out, and they tend to be things that are actionable, doable, and achievable, right? So what are our shared aspirations for our community? That immediately changes the frame of reference from problems that put us in a toxic debate or utopian visions that are irrelevant to most people's lives. So that's number one. Number two, this is why I think we got to get moving, because people change their minds when they begin to see evidence and reasons to believe, not facts, but reasons to believe that things can be different. So what that means is we don't need everyone to start moving. We just need some small group of people to get moving and demonstrating that actually we can achieve something different. And when people begin to see it, if you think of this as concentric circles, right? The people in the close-in circles are going to start to say, oh, I'd like to be a part of that. So think about this. We're experiencing a negative contagion right now called COVID that's destroying people's lives. I think what we need to be focused on is how do we create a positive contagion of hope that's rooted in real actions, not rhetoric. And these actions are small actions that people can begin to see, around which more and more people will begin to join. And that's where you'll begin to see, as we're seeing in Kentucky, it didn't matter who people voted for president. They believe they need to solve the meth and opioid crisis. They believe their kids are falling through the cracks and they need to lift them up. They believe that too many people are going to bed hungry at night. It didn't matter who they voted for president. They want to solve these problems in their community, and they're getting more and more people together to do that. That's the path I think we got to get on. Now it's going to take a little time, right? Nope. There's no quick fix here. And Americans want a quick fix because we think of everything as consumerism, right? But we're talking about being citizens and being part of a democracy and being part of communities. That's not the same as going online or going to Target and buying something off the shelf and getting immediate gratification, right? It's one of the things we have to begin to shift.
Well
I hope
done.
that helps.
Well
Yes,
done. Well
great.
done. Good
Yes,
answer.
great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we have a very interesting question from Elena. Elena, go ahead.
Hi.
Hey, Elena.
Hello. You're almost as good looking as your brother.
Well, you know, they say the apple doesn't fall too far from the oldest brother. So
I can see that.
And their mother is here, so she would be very.
I'm trying to borrow some of his brains. That actually would be a good thing.
I think in our club, we're all trying to do that. My question is kind of an extension or piggybacking on Lucicita's question. So her question was about how to change other people's mind. My question is how to change my mind.
There you go.
And the question is, I see various causes, right? And protests for various topics or issues. And I start with associating and supporting those causes, but then I see that those protests, they turn to violence.
Mm-hmm.
And I come from the country where neither people nor the government actually respect human life or property of other people, right? So maybe that makes me extra sensitive to this kind of things. And so how can I change my mind so that to be able to connect with people who are thinking differently and behaving differently, and being able to truly open my mind, not just to have a goal of, okay, let me figure out how to get those people to work with me, but truly open my mind and be able to align with people and work together. I guess that would be my question.
Yeah, we spend a lot of time with people on this. We call it how you show up, right? So a lot of what I've talked about is sort of what happens in the larger society, but a lot of where this work needs to begin is within ourselves and how we decide to show up in the world. And I think it's about gaining clarity about what it is that you really value. What do you really stand for in terms of what you value? What's most important to you? And how is it that you make a deal with yourself? First, how do you get clarity about that? Second, how is it that you make a deal with yourself about what it means to show up in exercising those values, those things that you value most, and looking for opportunities? You know, we all have spheres of influence, and we tend not to think about this too much, right? But we all have spheres of influence, and those spheres are places where we can take action. They're places where, to use your words, you can find allies or align yourself with others. And so what I would urge you to do is A, get really clear about what you stand for. B, make a deal with yourself. We have something on our website called a personal covenant that you can download and fill out that would help you do this. Make a deal with yourself about how you're going to show up. And then third, I think what you want to do is really think about where you can go find people to begin to work together in these ways that will deepen or restore your belief that it's possible and get you on a better path where you're actually acting on these things that are really valuable to you. Always knowing, and here's the thing that I think we need to keep in mind, and I think you know this from your home country, but I think this is really critical. Amid the good things that we're doing, there's still going to be a predominance of negative things happening in our society. There's still, amid the good things that are happening, there is evil. I happen to be one who believes in evil. I don't just believe in goodness. I actually believe there is evil also. And so part of what needs to happen is when we're finding allies, we need to find people we can stand next to so that as we begin to get pushed around as we begin to see these negative things happening, as these negative narratives begin to penetrate our mind and take over our attitudes and mindsets and behaviors and actions, that we can turn to other people and they can help us stay on the path that we want to be on, notwithstanding the bad things, the ugly things, the evil things that we're seeing taking place in society. And I think that becomes a really critical part of moving forward in the environment that we're in. And I think we just need to be realists about that. So
You're talking perspective, Richard. You're talking perspective and how to expand that and how to open my own perspective.
yeah, I think,
And be responsible for growing that.
yeah, look, I've been doing this work for so long now, and we can talk about all the things that other people need to do.
No, me.
No, I know. This is why I'm saying it. This is why I appreciate what you're saying. It's why I appreciate Elena's question, is that we as Americans tend to want to point the finger at other people.
That's a human condition.
Right? And I think one of the things that we need to do, and one of the reasons why I named this book Stepping Forward, is that we've got to look at ourselves. We've got to decide, what kind of country do we want to help build? We can't just contract it out to other people. We know that our politicians in Washington, D.C., a lot of them are corrupt. They're weak. They're unwilling to take hard positions. They're going to follow us. We're not going to follow them, right? I've never worked, going back, Lois, to your question, I've never worked in a community where the politicians were the ones who were leading the change. They were always following. They were always following. So the choice is ours. The choice is ours. And I think we need to step forward. We need to get together and do things. It doesn't mean that we don't need systemic action by government. I believe in government, but we need to set the direction and give people who want to take action cover so that they'll step forward themselves and take action as well. So I agree with you, Tom. This has to start with many of us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Richard. Well, in your book, Richard, you mentioned that education should be everybody's business. And I think we all agree here that when we improve the education, we kind of are attacking one of the root causes of all of our problems. But do you think we are doing everything in our hands to improve the education in our country, and how our regular citizens can help?
Yeah, no, I don't think we are. And frankly, we do a lot of work on education. We're launching 3 new cities this month, working on educational equity issues across the country. I know some of you are school teachers. I think we have laid all of our society's problems at the schoolhouse door. We expect school teachers to be referees. We expect them to be psychologists. We expect them to be mothers and fathers. We expect them to do everything in our schools. And I don't know how in God's name they can do all those things and still educate our kids. But there's even more to it than that. Let me give you a really specific example. We were working in Youngstown, Ohio, on education. And the school superintendent and the school board had come up with a school reform package. The schools had been taken over by the governor, and they'd all come up with a package that looked like anything you could download off the internet. And it was all about what school teachers needed to do and principals needed to do. And, a lot of it made sense. But when we went out and talked to people in the community and talked to kids as well, youth, what we found out is that a lot of the youth in these communities and a lot of their parents, these kids grew up in poverty. They grew up in homes where their parents were taking drugs. They grew up in neighborhoods where there were gunshots every day and every night. Unlike a lot of us, when we put our head down on the pillow at night when we were kids and went to bed, we actually believed, many of us, not all of us, but many of us, that tomorrow could be better than today. For most of the kids in Youngstown, when they put their heads on the pillow at night, they believed that tomorrow was going to be worse than today. that they were going to go to schools where teachers didn't care about them, where they were going to come home to empty houses, where there wasn't going to be dinner, where there weren't adults who unconditionally loved them in their lives, where there was no place for them to go after school, right? Now, if we believe that schools can fix all those problems, then we are living in some make-believe fantasy land. We got to get real about this. If we really value our children, if we really care about their futures, if we really love them, then I don't know any other way than for communities to come together and take responsibility for their kids. And I mean all kids, not just kids who have the same color skin as we do, or pray to the same God as we do, or live on the same part of town that we do. I mean all kids, all kids. And that means that we've got to create networks in our communities where adults put their arms around kids and support them. When that happens, grades go up, graduation rates go up, kids succeed in life. We've got to make sure that kids have after-school activities that are productive and where they're supervised and where kids believe they're safe. Too many kids live in places that aren't safe.
Absolutely.
We got to do something about that. We've got too many kids who are going to bed hungry at night. How in God's name, if you go to bed hungry at night and you wake up hungry in the morning, do we believe that you're going to be able to go into a classroom and learn algebra? You're thinking about food and survival.
Basics.
Right? Not some algebraic equation. That's not the school's responsibility. That's the community's responsibility.
The family's responsibility.
Well, partly the families, but also the communities. And we've got to come together. Now in Clark County and Winchester, where we're working in Kentucky, this is what they're doing. In Spokane, Washington, where we were working with them, that's what they're doing. In Mobile, Alabama, where they hadn't passed a school levy in 40 years, and they've passed one every year since, they've closed the achievement gap. They've got more kids graduating. They've got more girls taking STEM classes. They got more kids going on to college or vocational school. And importantly, in that community, they're creating a sense of hope for their future. We can do this. This is not a pipe dream. This is not fantasy land. But we've got to make the commitment to do it, and we've got to get organized to do it.
Thank you, Richard. I love that call of action because it's definitely, as you said, it's our responsibility. And it's not that we are just put it in somebody else's shoulders, right? Great. Well, we have a question very interesting from Chris. Chris, go ahead.
Well, I have a couple, actually. The first is, where do you start? I mean, you wrote stories, and I loved them, of bringing people together after catastrophes in Sandy Hook or in Flint. And I love your message of, if we can just get together with each other, cross that threshold, that is the core of how we grow and how we build. But so, for example, I live in a middle-class gated condo community. We are in a building. There's 4 townhouses in this building. We've been here for many years. I only know the names of 2 of the other residents in my building. You know, how do you start building community? How do you cross that threshold when there is no disaster that brings people together by necessity?
Right. Well, there's no apparent disaster, right? There's no acute disaster. There are chronic disasters that we're living through every day. But, you know, look, first of all, let me just say that I think we need more organizations and groups in communities that know how to bring people together, because it's helpful to have intermediaries who can organize us and help us move in a common direction. We don't have enough of those organizations anymore. So one of the things the Institute is doing is helping to build more and more of those organizations. We're working with thousands of public libraries across the country right now who are doing incredible work doing that as well as other groups. So that's one thing I just want to say, because I don't think this just sort of it can be difficult to happen otherwise. Beyond that, what I would say for someone like yourself is I would figure out what moves you, what you're passionate about, and I would look for an existing group, whether it's in one of those 4 buildings that you described, right? Because we're doing this around COVID. People have organized around COVID in ways they never thought we could before, right? We've organized into new networks to make sure we're taking care of senior citizens who are shut in. We're making sure that food gets delivered. We're making sure that kids have learning pods that that are supervised and they can learn from. So it's possible, but I would say you could put the word out in those 4 buildings and say you want to work on something, or you could go look for an organization that's already doing good work and join that organization's work.
That's a perfect segue to my next question. What I put in the chat there is, I love technology. That technology is my passion, and it distresses me no end that technology is part of our problem. I mean, the echo chamber that Facebook and all that, and there is one that I have not yet joined and that I wonder might be. Do you know about Nextdoor, and what do you think of the Nextdoor app? Is it a positive force for a community organization?
Well, I think it's a positive force because it connects people, right? It's a platform to connect people in productive ways. So I think in that sense, as a connector, it's useful. Whether or not, I think then the question becomes, who do you choose to connect with on that, and toward what end, right? Because you want to move towards something. But I imagine that if you said, I'm really interested in issue X or topic X, and I'm looking for 5 other people who want to get together and start talking about this and see whether or not we can do something even in our complex. I bet you, I'll make a deal with you right here. I bet you if you did that in the next 3 weeks and you called me or I called you, that you would have those 4 or 5 people. I bet you that. So that's one idea.
Okay.
The second idea is this: if you're really concerned about things like Facebook and information and other things, where do you live in the Miami-Dade area?
Fort Lauderdale. Yeah.
Fort Lauderdale, okay. So there are all sorts of news experiments going on as well in that area, funded in part by the Knight Foundation, whose headquarters is in Miami. And they're experimenting with all sorts of things around citizen journalism, meaning citizens producing news that is more fair and balanced and that reflects more of the reality of people's lives. So that's another option for you if you're interested in technology, because this is all technology based, and they probably need citizen journalists who want to participate in that. So that would be another avenue to go.
Thank you.
But you got to call me. You got to call me in 3 or 4 weeks and tell me whether or not you found those 4 people.
Okay, will do.
All right.
Thanks for being here.
Okay,
we will be asking Chris as well. I guess we are all curious about the result of that. Okay, our next question, Marcela. Marcela has a question. Marcy, go ahead.
Gracias, Adriana. Thank you, Adriana. So we read the book and the stories, and I've been listening and following you on different podcasts and your own podcast, the Harwood Institute podcast and everything. So my question is, what are the outcomes for all these huge projects that you have worked on that you feel more fascinated about?